Welcome, everyone, to our town hall with Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. Today's event is presented by the League of Women Voters. I am Linda Whitmore from the West Contra Costa County League. The League of Women Voters is a national, nonpartisan organization established to encourage citizen participation in government. It never supports or opposes any political party or candidate. Statements and opinions are presented in the interest of public service and in no way are to be construed as endorsement thereof by the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters takes no responsibility for any of the views or facts stated. The four leagues of Assembly District 15, the West Contra Costa County League, the Oakland League, the Berkeley, Albany, Emeryville League, and the Piedmont League are co-sponsoring the town hall. We invite you to join the league and become part of producing events like this one. It's easy to do. Just visit any one of our websites listed at the end of the town hall or Google Find My Local League for information on how to join. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Adina Ishii. Adina is a member of the Berkeley, Albany, Emeryville League, where she has been an extraordinary leader. She was the first woman of color and youngest person ever to be elected to serve as their league president. She made it her mission to help the league become more inclusive and diverse, and during her presidency, increased both membership and diversity, attracting many new members under 30. Adina is a role model for us all. And now I turn the microphone over to Adina.
Thank you, Linda, for that lovely introduction. My role today is actually just to introduce the Assembly member and also to our moderator. Assemblymember Buffy Wicks has represented the East Bay in the California State Assembly since she was first elected in 2018. She was re-elected just last year in 2020. Her district covers communities from Oakland to Richmond, including Berkeley, Albany, and Emeryville. Assemblymember Wicks's work in the Assembly focuses on housing, expanding the social safety net, consumer protections, and championing the rights of women and working families. Governor Gavin Newsom signed 8 of her bills in her first year in office, and despite the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, signed 7 of her bills into law in 2020. A lifelong community organizer, Assemblymember Wicks previously served on both of President Barack Obama's campaigns and worked for him in the White House. She lives in Oakland with her husband, Peter, and daughters, Jojo and Ellie. And our moderator today is going to be Moni Flores-Bauer. Moni is a past president of the League of Women Voters of Oakland and currently serves on the League of Women Voters United States nominating committee. Here's Moni. Thank you.
Thank you, Adina, and welcome to everyone joining us this evening. Thank you for being with us here on May 5th, 2021 for this town hall connecting the residents of Assembly District 15 and our Assembly member, Ms. Buffy Wicks. As previously mentioned, there are 4 leagues hosting this forum for you all tonight. Again, it's the West Contra Costa County League of Women Voters, the Piedmont League of Women Voters, the Berkeley, Albany, Emeryville League of Women Voters, and the Oakland League of Women Voters. California's Assembly District 15 stretches across 2 counties and many cities from Hercules to Piedmont, and roughly includes about 420,000 residents. It is a pleasure for us to present this event, which in times of virtual meetings takes the place when we would normally get together in person, meet and greet and see our neighbors and be face to face with our elected representatives. This town hall is being live streamed on YouTube and is also being recorded for local leagues' use on their websites. This is the format we have, and this is the format we hope will give you ample time to ask your questions of Assemblymember Wicks. We're going to hear from her first with a presentation. Then we'll be moving on to your questions and answers. We'll wrap up around 6:25 when Assemblymember Wicks will have some closing comments, and then we'll conclude at 6:30. Your microphones are all muted, but your questions can be submitted at any time. You can begin sending in your questions by using the question box feature on your screen. You'll notice the chat box is not enabled, so that's not a place to send any comments or questions. Again, the chat box is not being monitored. Use the question box to submit your questions. We'll take as many as we can in the time we have available. All right, so let's welcome Assemblymember Buffy Wicks.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me. I deeply appreciate it. In my 2018 race, I did probably 40 or 50 forums in that time. And I will say, I did 2 league forums, and I think they were the best run, most fair, most, I think, intellectually interesting and thought-provoking conversations that I had on the campaign. So I appreciate everyone's participation in those, and for you all to provide this really important platform for your elected officials, and I'm excited to answer questions. And so with that, I know I have put together a presentation, but I think the format is I will kind of give you just an overview of kind of where we are right now, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So why don't we go ahead and kick off the presentation here, and do you want to go to the next slide? So what we're going to talk about today, and this will be about 20 minutes is my goal, and then we can open it up for Q&A, or I think I have 20 or 30 minutes, but moderator, feel free to jump in and tell me to shut up if you need me to. But I want to talk about kind of state level updates, really looking at kind of the budget landscape initially, and then more specifically what legislation I'm working on in the legislature to give you a sense of kind of where we're at. Next slide. But first, I wanted to just do kind of a very quick recap of, my first 2 years in office, some of the kind of key highlights of things that I worked on. I was able to secure $30 million for our CalVIP, which is our California Violence and Intervention and Prevention programs. These are community-based organizations like Youth Alive or Advanced Peace that does direct violence intervention to really halt and stop gun violence in our communities. These programs work very, very well. California, embarrassingly, only has $9 million ongoing funding. My first year, I was able to get us $30 million. And as you'll learn in the future slides, it's a big priority for me again this year. California has seen a 46% increase in gun violence since the pandemic. And we have no more money left in the CalVIP program. So I'm actually asking for about $200 million that I'm hopeful that we will get to really help combat the gun violence that we're seeing in our community. So that was one of the things I worked on my first term in terms of one of the highlights. The other thing was I really have spent a lot of time working on housing and homelessness. I made it really a top priority of mine, aimed at both building more housing, missing middle housing, low income, affordable housing for our middle income folks. And I have a big budget ask this year to get some money for housing for teachers in Oakland. Our teachers have to commute very far because we don't pay them enough, and then we expect them to live in one of the most expensive markets in the country. So we're helping to support a pilot program there to ensure that our teachers can actually live in the communities here. But housing production and creating more housing is very important to me, and one of the issues that I'm very passionate about and have spent the last couple of years working on. As mentioned, I was able to get, I think it says 16 here, I don't know if it's 15 or 16, I can't remember, bills to the governor's desk in my first term. And, I worked on a number of different things. I helped establish a new program to create clean air centers in times of those high smoke days that we have in October and November for our folks that don't have access to clean air, folks that are homeless, folks that are more vulnerable like seniors, to create clean air centers. I worked and was able to pass a bill to allow BART to buy directly off the grid, thereby getting rid of the middleman, saving more money and helping us to reach our renewable energy goals. I've done a lot of work in the food security space, have passed a couple bills that have been signed into law around food, one of which is ensuring and making a more streamlined process. You know, a lot of folks in my district qualify for a free or reduced lunch. They should also be signed up for our CalFresh program to ensure that they have food, not just in school, but outside of school as well. I codified into law our California Violence Intervention Prevention Program, in addition to getting additional funds for it. You know, on the housing front, I was able to pass a bill to allow churches to use their parking lots to build affordable housing and their parking spaces to make that more easier. And a number of different kind of consumer protection type bills and laws and other things that I worked on in my first term. So now let's quickly move on to what we're doing now, which is the next slide. So just in terms of the budget, and you can go to the next slide, our kind of overall philosophy here is to preserve, respond, protect, and recover. And what I say when I mean that, you know, if you look at what had happened last year when COVID hit, it was actually kind of interesting. Like, I came in my first term, and the first year we had this budget surplus, and, you know, I was a brand new member, and looking at, we have 2/3 control, Democrats do, of the state, Assembly and the Senate. We have this brand new governor. And so that was all exciting. And then all of a sudden, boom, COVID hit. And we were looking at a loss of potentially billions of dollars or tens of billions of dollars in the budget. And we were very, very concerned about what that could be. The shortfall was almost 37% of the current $147 million general fund budget. Our K through 12 schools and community colleges stood to lose $18 billion alone, which was very, very concerning. And in June of 2020, Newsom closed on an estimate of about $54 billion in deficits that we were looking at. And the picture became very, very bleak. And all of that has really shifted now, which is exciting, but also surprising. Our budget is looking much better than what we had anticipated, in part because there's been record stock market gains and tax growth from our most affluent residents. And you can see that income inequality is presenting itself to us, right? The wealthy did okay and did well in this pandemic, and our working class people did not. And that's something we definitely have to address. But what it's resulted in is a $57 billion surplus in general funds, which has been something that I think we didn't anticipate. Plus, we have roughly $26 billion on its way from Washington, D.C. in form of the American Rescue Plan that Joe Biden has put together. Plus, he's put together and announced other proposals, big infrastructure money, potentially, the child tax credit, all these other ideas that, hopefully will come to fruition to help benefit our California constituents. And so the bottom line is our budget's looking much, much better than we thought. So, when we say preserve, we're talking about, really, restoring state services, such as, reserving funds for future shortfalls, and restoring the one-time funding for the 2020 cuts as it pertained to our UC system and our CSUs and our courts, et cetera. So that's an important piece of this. When we talk about respond, providing, essential state response to COVID-19, that's an example of that, is increasing workplace safety enforcement, ensuring, transparency and oversight of disaster funding, and protecting our vulnerable seniors in terms of the nursing skilled facilities. When we talked about protecting, that's another big principle of the budget this year, helping those Californians most impacted by the crisis, expanding our social safety net support, ensuring we have ongoing homeless prevention funding. That's a big issue for both the governor as well as in the Assembly this year, in terms of really funding that. I think is going to be very, very important. Expanding, current housing support and existing and assistance programs that target our most vulnerable Californians. And then when we talk about recovery, we're talking about a sort of a targeted stimulus to help Californians rebuild the economy. And one of the things I say often, people say, when are we going to return to normal? And what I say is, normal wasn't working for so many people to begin with. And so how are we laying a new framework around the types of communities we want to live in and the types of policies that we support? Let's expand, broadband to make sure everyone has access to the internet. Let's address the polluted water systems that we have, clean up our abandoned toxic sites. Like, we have a whole bunch of things we can do now with this, I think, renewed moment and this renewed funding. And so let's think about what that recovery looks like. Let's ensure we have paid leave, better paid leave policies and early childhood care, and we're funding our schools more. So those are some of the things that we're looking to do with the budget here. And I'll just go into a little bit more detail here in the next slide. So this year, the big focus for us is going to be on reinvesting in our public health infrastructure due to COVID-19, including vaccine distribution. Shots in arms has been a big priority for the governor. It's a big priority for the legislature, making sure that we really beat the pandemic through our public health measures with the vaccines. Ensuring that we have testing capacity and behavioral health responses has also been critical. Secondly is reopening our K through 12 schools. This has been a huge issue that I hear about a lot in our districts. I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the teachers who were very nervous about going back to our schools, and was a big proponent of getting teachers to have access to vaccines as soon as humanly possible. They are now vaccinated. We are now reopening our schools. We have to continue to do that and work towards full-time, 5 days in person. I do recognize there will be certain communities that are still going to be very hesitant for good reason. They were hit harder. They're communities of color. Frankly, our country has failed them in many ways, in terms of, you look at our education system at large, look at our criminal justice system, look at our environmental justice issues, right? So we have to rebuild that trust within those communities, but also ensure that we're doing that by getting families back into schools, I think is going to be very important. The other piece that I am focused on, and I think there's a big state commitment, as I mentioned earlier, is reducing gun violence in our communities. That has been a big priority for me. I'm pushing for a $200 million ask so we can fund these organizations to end the gun violence in our communities. Next slide. So continuing on that, in terms of what the state is focused on, significant resources for our ongoing homeless prevention funding. Project Home Key has been successful. We use federal funds to convert SROs into supportive housing. We want to continue to do that, ensure we can use those resources that we got for COVID relief for ongoing homelessness funding. I will tell you, we are not doing enough as a state on this issue, period. And I feel that, and I see it, and I hear it, and it is one of my biggest concerns, and we have got to do more. I'm very committed to that, and we'll continue to work with the governor, with our leadership in the Assembly. The Senate Pro Tem, I know, is also very dedicated to this. Our state is failing on this issue, and we have got to do more. So we're going to continue to doing that, hopefully with some historic investments in homelessness. Mitigating the impact of COVID in our state prisons. We've failed to a certain degree there as well, and allowed COVID to run rampant in our prisons. So that's something we have to address as well. Implementing TK for all 4-year-old children is part of the Assembly budget process that we're looking at, and really more broad supports for early childhood care. And then creating a statewide program to prevent evictions and support mom and pop landlords, and making sure that we're both supporting and protecting the tenants, as well as ensuring that our mom and pop landlords have the resources they need to make sure that they can cover their mortgage as well. So those are some of the things the state is focused in on. And I'll just tick through these more quickly, and then we can pivot to some of the stuff that I'm working on specifically. But streamlining programs to reduce barriers of entry for our vulnerable Californians. I'm working on Healthy Start Initiative, which would provide state resources for folks to help get people in our low-income communities through their schools signed up for things like Medi-Cal and CalFresh and other safety net programs. Californians leave a lot of federal money on the table that are entitlements that we have unlimited access to because we don't sign people up for these programs. And so it's making sure that our more vulnerable communities have access to these and are signing up for these programs. Providing streamlined assistance to small businesses. We just put a bunch of money in small business grants. When I drive around my community, I see how hard our restaurants have been hit, our small business community. We have to do everything we can to ensure that they have the resources they need to survive. They are some of our biggest employers. Our small businesses tend to be owned increasingly by people of color and women. So we want to make sure we're supporting those communities and making sure that they have access to capital, et cetera. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is modernizing our EDD, which is where people get their unemployment insurance. This issue has been a huge issue in all of our districts. I get a nightly email of all the constituent outreach that's happened in my office. And every night there are dozens of stories of people who have not been able to access their unemployment insurance. And they are heartbreaking stories. And it is very frustrating. And our legislators across the board, regardless of party ideology, have been pounding the pavement on this issue, trying to get more resources and ensure that we get our unemployment insurance into the hands of people who need it most. And so I am very committed to that. And I have a bill on that, which I'll talk about in a second, but that's another important piece of the equation. So let me talk specifically about my legislative package. That was just sort of an overview of kind of what's happening in the state at the moment. And I'll also say, if you want to know more about the budget, we can host another conversation with budget staff to walk through all the ins and outs if that's something that is of interest to you all. So let me know if that's of interest and we can organize that. But let's pivot now to the bills that I'm specifically carrying. So one of the things that came out of COVID-19, I think, is a real understanding that we don't have the right and robust social safety nets to help our working families who are trying to raise children. You know, if you look at other countries in Europe, you know, they have extensive paid leave policies. They have affordable and easily accessible early childhood care. We just don't have that in the United States of America. And it's apparent, you know, and actually there's a report done every year called the Happiness Report. I think it's Happiness Index. And they looked at all these different countries. And the question is, are you happier with children or not? And in America, it's actually, people are not, unless you make money. But if you're working class, it's much more difficult. Childcare is incredibly expensive in this country. In Europe, you're actually happier with a family, with children, because they have robust programs for paid leave and early childhood care. It's much more difficult here in the US, particularly for low-income communities. They are stretched thin. Even for middle-class families, it's difficult. It's actually cheaper. And I have two children. I have a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old, and I'm paying full-time childcare for both of them. Nothing fancy, just regular old childcare. It's actually cheaper for me to send my children to University of California at Berkeley than it is for me to afford early childhood care. That is a problem. And, you know, my husband and I are making it work, but it's very, very, very difficult and very, very expensive. And it shouldn't be like that. And this is also an issue that contributes to our achievement gap issues. So I have a bill, two bills I'm working on that pertain to caregivers. One is the Chosen Family Act. Basically in California, we have decent paid leave policies and decent paid sick policies, comparatively speaking to the rest of the country. But they're for a very narrow definition of family. Basically, if you're legally bound or blood bound, right? A lot of families don't live in this type of nuclear family environment. You know, it's a modern world, and this type of language that exists within our policies disproportionately impacts the LGBTQ community and new immigrants who often live in multi-generational housing. So this bill would expand who can actually take leave to care for a family member. So this is an important bill to me. It's being sponsored by Equality California, and I'm plotting it through the system right now, and trying to work with the business community who has been opposing the bill to ensure that we have safeguards in place that doesn't totally negatively impact the business community, but also ensuring we modernize our language around this. The other bill I have is an Anti-Discrimination for Caregivers Act. Basically, folks who have to care for someone, either a new child, or any child, or a person with disabilities, or a parent. At some point, all of us will be caregivers. Most all of us will be caregivers. So this establishes caregivers as a protected class. What we see is, particularly parents of young kids, get discriminated against in terms of, and it's often moms, in terms of getting promotions, in terms of being hired, because the employer thinks, oh, they're not going to be able to get the job done. You know, they're going to deal with their kids, right? We see that over and over again. There's a lot of data on this point. So this would add caregivers as a protected class, and also require employers to allow for a reasonable accommodation if an emergency comes up. So, you know, child school gets shut down. Can I go pick up my kid and drop her off at my sister's house? Something like that, right? Allowing for that kind of reasonable accommodation. You know, and I had my daughter at an 8-hour public safety committee hearing last week because we had a childcare issue come up. I'm lucky I'm a legislator, I can do that. Most people can't take their kids to work with them because of the nature of their job, or their employer doesn't want that. But we have to be able to have more accommodation. And I think we've learned that in COVID-19. Next slide. So housing and tenant protections. So as I mentioned, I've worked a lot in the housing space. I have been pushing on a bill to create a state rental data. And this has taken many forms over the last couple of years, but where it is today is, as part of the COVID-19 relief funds, the federal government required data to be collected, ensuring that, we have a good sense of who needs to receive the data, the ethnic breakdown of that, if there was rental increases, if there were evictions, things of this nature. Having this type of data is actually very important as a lawmaker, so we understand the negative impacts of our housing market. And so I'm trying to retain that data so that our UC system and our think tanks and our journalists have access to it, so we can see what is actually the state of our rental market right now. So I'm working to retain that data and hopefully to build on it. A lot of cities have started rental registries. So I'm hopeful that we can create a statewide rental registry. The second piece on the housing is my housing preservation and tax default property. And basically, we have buildings that have been experiencing tax default. They're sitting there, they're vacant, they're blighted properties. We want to make sure we can move those into the hands of affordable housing developers, and all the while keeping our existing tenants housed, so we can convert that into long-term supportive housing. So consumer protections, I sit on both the Privacy and Consumer Affairs Committee as well as the Banking Committee, which we have a lot of financial consumer protections coming out of there. As I mentioned, I'm doing a bill on EDD reform to create an Office of the Claimant Advocate to ensure that people have somewhere to go when they have a problem with EDD. I'm working on a bill to add more regulation to the debt settlement industry. These are the companies that say, like, consolidate your loans with us and we'll negotiate your debt. And while they work for many people, there's also bad actors in that space. We want to make sure people aren't getting taken advantage of, especially when they need the help desperately. So that's an important bill. And then Kids Act, as I mentioned, I have a 4-year-old. She likes to look at my phone and go online and look at the tablet. But we want to really block manipulative design features that lure kids into sharing their data, to making purchases, that send kids down these rabbit holes of algorithms on YouTube that end up in wildly different places. So some safeguards and more guardrails around how kids are using online platforms is really key. The next section I'm working on is criminal justice. I have a bill that would extend statute of limitations for victims who were sexually assaulted by law enforcement officers. And this bill came to me because there have been some problems with law enforcement officials sexually assaulting victims, and the victims not feeling that they had the power to fight law enforcement because they were still employed by their agency. So this would extend the statute of limitations and try to create a more level playing field, which is, I think, just an important bill. I'm also doing some work on my double sentencing bill, which gives more judicial discretion. Right now, if someone commits multiple crimes, the judge is forced to take the harshest sentencing. We want to give the judge more discretion because there may be, a context that isn't taken into account there. And hopefully this will reduce our sentencing that we have. We really need to, in my opinion, take a hard look at sentencing enhancements and things like that, and reduce the amount of folks who are in our prisons and put more resources into rehabilitative programs. Some other critical priorities that I'm working on. This is my Race and Healthcare Transparency Act. I'm working with SEIU, which is a really important partner in this, but basically establishing the collection of data on patient health with regard to race, ethnicity, and other demographics, as well as the workforce in hospitals and other places that provide care, to make sure that, what we saw with COVID, and we knew this before, was that our healthcare system has racial disparities, right? That we have systemic racism within our healthcare industries. And so the only way I think we can address that is if we shine a bright spotlight on it, have a good sense of the data, and then create policies to address that. And I use this example, in my district, if you're from West Oakland and you are Black or brown, you live on average 10 years less than if you're from the Oakland Hills and you're white. A 10-year life expectancy. And we saw with COVID, right? The communities that were hit hardest, Black and brown communities, in terms of access to care, maternal health. It's Black and brown women who have less access to quality care, and frankly, who are believed less when they're experiencing issues medically. So we want to make sure that we're shining a spotlight on this and really understanding where are the inequities within our healthcare system so we can address them. I'm also working on a bill to allow FEMA funds to be used for childcare providers. I worked a lot with the childcare providers in my district during COVID-19. And again, these are predominantly women of color who own these, they're small business owners, basically, who are providing childcare for our littlest ones. And a lot of them went under, because of they were shut down, they had rent, they had all these issues. And these are women who put and some men, but mostly women who put their heart and soul into caring for our littlest ones. And so want to do what we can to prevent that from happening again. And then just in terms of some of the budget asks, I've already mentioned this a little bit, but I'm asking for about $200 million to support our CalVIP programs. I will continue to always carry that budget ask. It matters a lot to me. As I've said, we've seen a huge increase in gun violence in my communities and our communities since COVID-19, and we want to reverse that. I will also say I'm very energized by Biden's approach on gun safety and gun violence prevention. And he's rolled out some aggressive executive actions, and we need nationwide background checks and nationwide efforts. We have pretty good gun laws here in California, but it's a porous state. And a lot of the guns come over from Nevada and they come over from Arizona because they don't have very good gun violence prevention policies in place there. So we need federal laws on this. Food banks, I've done a lot of work with the food banks in my district and statewide. I'm carrying $110 million one-time general fund asked to help address food security in our communities. When COVID-19 hit, many of our students get their food at school. That's where they eat. And our kids were literally going hungry, and our food banks were doing everything they can. They need the resources to be successful. They're such well-run organizations and they do such good work. And so we want to make sure they're funded. And then another one of the asks I'm doing is a district-specific ask. It's, again, this Oakland pilot program for $11 million for a program called Teachers Rooted in Oakland to ensure that our teachers can live in the communities in which they're teaching. So those are some of the budget asks that I'm doing. And with that, hopefully I didn't talk too much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all have. Oh, you're muted.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you, Assemblymember Wicks. We appreciate all those highlights. We know you want to hear from the folks in Assembly District 15, and that's what this next segment's about. This is the town hall part where the questions are flowing because you've touched on so many topics. Now we have a variety of questions for you as well. And so again, just a reminder for those of you who want to pose a question, use the question box to pose your question. We've got screeners looking through those, and we're making sure we don't have repeat questions and we get a variety. And we hope to have as many questions as we can handle with some quick turnaround. So our first question for you is, here we go. Despite the demonstration of effectiveness of telework during COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders, state departments are eager to return to the status quo of all government employees commuting to the office. This is both costly for taxpayers and has negative impacts on the environment and on the climate. Do you support mandated telework options for state employees or incentives for departments who allow telecommunicating?
That's great. And sorry, could you also tell me who asked the question? I didn't hear that.
We don't have names attributed to the questions.
Okay, that's fine. It's an interesting question. I think what we will see coming out of this is more flexibility across the board. And I think more flexibility works for state workers if it makes sense. It depends on obviously the job, right? It depends on, what the requirements of the job are. And, I think it'll depend on what it is. But I think more flexibility makes sense. What we saw, one thing I was inspired by, COVID has been very challenging, obviously, for many of us for different reasons. But remember when COVID first hit and there were like literally no cars on the road, and all of a sudden there was like more butterflies and more birds. And it was just like, it was like the environment was sort of taking over, which was pretty amazing. And I think more flexibility is warranted, I think, for a lot of our workforce. And I think that would also, be applicable to our state workers as well.
All right, the next question. Annual devastating wildfires seem to be here to stay for the foreseeable future. What is the state legislature doing to mitigate the effects of them and to combat the underlying cause of them, global climate change?
This is, to me, one of the most important questions I'll probably get asked tonight, because, and I know many of you have, attended some of these events before where I've spoke, but, my dad was a firefighter for 35 years and I grew up in the Sierra Nevadas. And when I was younger, we didn't have a 8 or 9 month fire season. We had a 2 or 3 month fire season. And that was just, 20, 30 years ago. Right. And it's just so crazy how things have shifted so quickly, and it's our own fault that that's happening. It's our own fault because of our policies or lack of policies around climate change and what we're doing. It's our own fault in terms of, forest management. It's our own fault in terms of just a lack of political will and awareness to actually really fundamentally address the issue. So I think there's a number of things we need to do to fix the problem, and this is going to sound a little like I'm going to be sort of connecting a lot of dots here, but I view our housing and our transportation policy as environmental policy, right? Are we going to continue to keep building out into the suburbs and exurbs? Or are we going to build more densely in our cities and ensure that we don't have these long commutes, and with that, are we going to fund public transportation, right? So that we don't have, our essential workers and teachers and others who are living in Stockton and Tracy commuting to Oakland and Berkeley every single day and spending 4 hours on the road to get here. 41% of our, of our pollution comes out of our gas pipes, right? And so how we live, I think, is very critical. It's supporting things like EVs, but EVs for low-income families too. We have to be mindful of the equity issues when we take these issues into account. So there's a number of things I think we need to do. I know the governor is committed to it. I'm committed to it as well, and we have, I think, Assembly and Senate leadership that is as well. But to me, it's one of the issues that is of the utmost emergency to deal with, because it is real, it is felt, we're going to feel it. I'm very worried about where we are this year. If you look at how much rain we had this past winter, we're already basically in a drought, and we had 5 or 6 days of rain. I mean, it was in a crazy amount of lack of rain this year. So it's very, very concerning.
Thank you. All right, moving to housing. Given your true belief in the state housing bills that you're supporting and that you have supported, even as a co-author, how do you justify stripping all local control, oversight, and obligation to affordably house those from municipalities, stripping the control from the local cities?
The bottom line is we have to build more housing. I ran on this issue. I think it's important. I think that can be sort of achieved through sort of carrots and sticks. We've historically had problems where local municipalities have not wanted to build. And I think we are in a situation where it's incumbent upon all of us to build. And I'm a big believer in infill housing. I'm a big believer in, ensuring that we're not expanding our current housing footprint into our green spaces out into, the eastern parts of the state. We should be protecting those and building more infill development in our communities where we have it, and I'm a believer in zoning reform. If you look at Berkeley, right? Berkeley was the first place where single family zoning came into existence. And I'm going to say something that might not be popular, but it's what I think. And so, you got to be true to who you are, right? And so Berkeley created single family zoning in this country, came from Berkeley. It had historical red line, problems. It excluded communities of color. And Berkeley is now on the precipice of getting rid of single family zoning and creating more density. I want to see communities that have diversity. I want to see multifamily housing, right? If you look in Rockridge, look at the Rockridge BART. We have invested as a society billions of dollars into the BART system because we think it's a public good, right? If you look at the BART, look across the street where the Zachary's Pizza is. It's 1 story. Shouldn't we have 2, 3, 4 stories on that of people who can then use that BART, right? And have access to this neighborhood, Rockridge neighborhood, and access to the schools and access to the grocery stores, and ensure that we're building a multiracial communities. So I'm just a big believer in upzoning. I'm a big believer in infill development. I think we can do it in a thoughtful way. I don't think it needs to be massive skyscrapers everywhere, but there was a bill I spoke out on the floor that some of you may have seen. I had my 4-week-old at the time at the end of session last year. SB 1120, it would have allowed single family zoning houses to be duplexes. That's a very simple concept in my mind of how you can create more density, right? Let's have more ADUs. Let's have duplexes and tris and quads. That's a way I think you can add more density without fundamentally changing the character of the neighborhood. So I think that stuff is important, and I do think it has to come from the state.
All right. This question from a resident is about healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
We are no longer considered patients, but consumers. And health insurance marketing is on overdrive. Do you think single payer healthcare would work in California? And if so, is AB 1400, the California Care Act, if it's brought back, will it be sufficient?
Yeah, and I've heard some of you say I talk too fast, which is like 1,000% true. So I will try not to talk so fast. I'm trying to answer all the questions, but I'll slow down a little bit. So apologies. So I'm a co-author of AB 1400. I believe in a single payer healthcare system. I think we need to work towards that. I am hopeful that we have a Democratic governor now who's going to be, I think, more amenable to a single payer system. I'll just be sort of honest with y'all. My dad is recovering from prostate cancer. He got diagnosed last year and underwent treatment. And fortunately for him, because he worked for the federal government for so long, he has decent health care. But my mom was showing me some of the bills that were coming his way. And if he didn't have health care, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's not okay. It's really not okay. The bill 1400, I think I'm not surprised it became a 2-year bill. So basically, in the legislature, we run 1-year or 2-year bills. And when we start the process of a 1-year bill, we can convert it into a 2-year bill. And often it happens all the time. I have a bunch of 2-year bills. I didn't even talk about them in my presentation because I have a whole bunch of them. And those tend to be bills that are harder, right? They're more controversial. They require more conversations. I think with a conversation around single payer healthcare, it's going to require a lot of conversations with the doctors, with the nurses, with the insurance companies, with the, healthcare advocates, with, the equity groups, there's a number of people that need to be part of that conversation. But I know I'm hopeful. We have a lot of members who are on that bill. I'm not the lead author, I'm a co-author, but Ash Kalera, one of my colleagues from the San Jose area, is the lead author. I'm hopeful that he'll continue to push that bill. And we've had a good partnership with the California Nurses Association on it and want to see it through.
Given your commitment to propose tools to address California and the Bay Area's housing affordability crisis, can you please talk some more about the rental registry bill, AB 1188, why it's necessary, how it would be effective, and what other tools you are proposing and or supporting in the state legislature? Sure.
And I'll give you a little bit of history on the bill. I was a joint author on the bill that established the anti-gouging rent cap, which established, a ceiling at which landlords could do rental increases every year. And I think it was a reasonable amount. It allowed landlords to increase a reasonable amount, but it really prevented the gouging that we have seen in some of the markets in the Bay Area. And we were hearing stories of constituents getting charged 30, 40, 50, 60% rent increases, and they simply couldn't afford it. So that bill was a 5% plus cost of living. In the process of creating that bill and figuring out where that cap should be, what we discovered is we actually don't really have any data available to policymakers on the rental market. And you have proprietary data like apartments.com who keep big databases. But for policymakers, we are flying blind on the rental market. We have anecdotal information, which we all hear about, but we don't actually really know the rate of evictions across the state. We don't know the rate of evictions in certain communities. We don't know the rent increases across the state or decreases. In some places, there may be decreases. And so the original idea was a statewide rental registry, which would be a 2-page form that landlords would fill out to say a couple different things. How much did you charge for rent? How big was the unit? Were there any evictions? would take 5 minutes. It was fought pretty heavily by the California Apartment Association and the realtors. I'm now on my third attempt of this bill where we're trying to collect the data that we know already exists that came from the COVID-19 federal funds that require this data to be collected if you were going to use those funds. And so we want to preserve that data and ensure that our UCs and others have access to it, so we have a better understanding of who needed the rental relief funds. Plus, take some cities, I think there's about a dozen or so that already have a rental registry or are in the process of creating a rental registry, and ensuring that we are trying to solicit that information so that we can see from a statewide point of view, what is the rental market? What is it looking like? And can we then create policies to help address that? So that's the premise behind the bill. I think it's important as a policymaker. I like to push for evidence-based policymaking, which involves having good data, similar to my health equity bill. We need the data to understand what's going on. So same thing applies to this bill. And we've put in privacy protections so that it's not, you can't look up by tenant name and that kind of information. But I think it's important. And it's also important as we do production to ensure that we're not causing overt displacement and gentrification. And if we had a database to have a better understanding that, we could see and then create policies to address those issues.
Housing continues to be a big topic tonight's town hall. Here's another one. Since about 90% of California cities and counties have fallen short of meeting their regional housing needs, for example, Emeryville, Oakland, Piedmont, and Richmond, they now have the highest nationwide rent, housing cost, and rate of homelessness, and tenants spending 50% or more of their income on housing. To even approach this rental housing needs compliance, should laws more strategic and or punitive than SB 35, should laws like that be passed that were passed in 2017, and similarly AB 215 pending in the legislature, should that be enacted? And if so, what different provisions might be more effective? Again, we're getting a question here about the comparison of legislation that's been proposed versus what the reality is showing us.
Yeah, no, I mean, the question is absolutely right, which is why, to my earlier point, this is why I think we need state intervention in terms of ensuring that our local municipalities are allowing for more housing to be built. It's not going to work to say, not in my backyard. It's not, that's not the world we live in now. It's not welcoming. And so we have to be more, as a society, I think, willing to build housing at all income levels. Our communities have to be willing to do it. They have to make the approval process easier. I've worked on a number of bills in this space, and I think it's critical. And I think that could be some combination of carrots and sticks to ensure it. But, the governor came out very strongly on this as well. He actually sued a community in Southern California that was refusing to build, which was pretty aggressive. But, we've got to be able to do some zoning reform, as I mentioned, like, SB 1120 from last year, which the duplex bill I think is key. I'm working on some upzoning bills. I think allowing for duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes is important. But and this is similar. It's the kind of the converse of the first question you asked about housing, but I think it means the state's much more involved in that process. But I will say, we are seeing a trend, and even in the last couple of years, Berkeley and Oakland are pushing towards getting rid of single family zoning, which is a pretty big deal. And so even at the municipal level, certain cities are pushing for this and saying, it's okay for us to have multifamily zoned house, right? It's okay for us to have quads and triplexes. And so hopefully the locals will continue to lead in that way. And certain cities have embraced it more. Emeryville has been much more open to multifamily housing than other places. I think you see certain parts of the communities that are more, I think, engaged in that and willing to create more housing. So I do think it's important, but we do have a housing production challenge, especially for very low income. It's very difficult. It's also incredibly expensive to build. There's also a bill that I just voted on the housing committee last week that would make it easier for nonprofit affordable housing developers to access state resources, because it's a very cumbersome process right now. So some of that streamlining I also think is very, very important. My colleague Tim Grayson, who represents another part of Contra Costa County, is leading on that bill. So there's some good bills coming to the legislature that I think will also help different aspects of the problem.
Okay. Are you working on any legislation this session that would turn California more towards restorative justice versus and away from punitive justice?
Yeah, I mean, this is, so I sit on the Public Safety Committee, and it's probably the most emotional committee that I sit on, because we hear firsthand, how our criminal justice system impacts people's lives on a daily basis. And I remember, I guess it was not last year because last year was COVID, but the year before that, I guess, my first year, Dr. Shirley Weber, who's now the Secretary of State, drove a bill successfully to bring about more change with regard to police use of force, deadly use of force. And in that bill, we had thousands of people come and testify in support of it. It took hours to hear public comment, and we had many of those people holding up pictures of people who had been killed at the hands of law enforcement. And it was very emotionally charged, and so these bills, I use that as an example to say, the Public Safety Committee that I sit on, I vote on a lot of this stuff all the time, and have done work in this space. I did a bill last year that was targeted at juveniles in terms of restorative justice work there. I have the bill this year that's giving more judicial discretion around sentencing. I think fundamentally we have to get rid of sentencing enhancements. For the most part, there might be some exceptions, but I think that's a piece of it. And when you look at the stats in the United States of America, 1 in 17 white men will go to jail or prison, and 1 in 3 Black men will go to jail or prison. And so the racial inequities on this issue are huge and profound. But you have people like my colleague, Senator Sidney Kamlager, who was in the Assembly, who's now in the Senate. She's been leading the charge in this space. We have some really good, coming out of the George Floyd protests, some very strong legislation, and our very own Nancy Skinner, who's done great work in this space, who is a fantastic senator. And I'm so lucky to have her as my senator. It's funny, actually, because some of the Assembly members don't get along with their senators, and they talk about what an issue that is. And I'm like, I'm so lucky because I love Nancy so much. But, I think generally speaking, the Assembly and the Senate is much more geared towards restorative justice, ensuring that we are kind of reeling back a lot of the stuff we did in the 90s with 3 strikes you're out, and these really sort of punitive measures that destroyed communities, particularly communities of color. So I believe fundamentally that we are in a very different frame of mind now as a government. And I do think that's been reflected over time in our policies and will continue to be reflected. Sorry, that was a little long-winded, but the point being, yes is the answer, and we need to continue to work on it.
We want to thank our audience. Your questions are coming through. Thank you very much. Keep them coming.
Keep them coming, guys. Keep them coming.
The cap and trade system has always had its critics as a significant way for oil and gas companies and others to reduce carbon emissions while continuing to pollute our air. The latest critical report in ProPublica published a study by Carbon Plan, a nonprofit, which has found that carbon emission reduction is being inflated because of the gaming of the cap and trade system. Mm-hmm. Would California be better off subsidizing renewable energy production to the extent that the fossil fuel industry would find it more profitable to stop fossil fuel production and transition to renewable energy production?
It's an interesting question. I think when cap and trade was passed, it was maybe the best we were going to get at that time. I mean, I wasn't in the legislature then, but there is no doubt we have to move to renewable energy and as fast as we possibly can. And I think we need to put all options on the table. I do think I'm inspired by the leadership of Biden on this, and he's trying to lead globally. But I do think that's an interesting idea, one we should consider. And, with the funds that we're going to be coming down from the federal government, something that we should seriously consider. Because I agree, it's a flawed system. And it's particularly really flawed when you look at places like Richmond, right? Where, our communities are feeling it more so than other places. So I do think it's an interesting idea that should be considered. Now could be the right time for that conversation.
Very good, thank you. This is your first year on the Transportation Committee.
Yes.
What are your priorities for clean vehicles, transit-centered development, and supporting public transit coming back from the COVID collapse? And thank you. This resident wants to say thank you for helping on AB 455 since Assemblymember or Senator Bonta moved on to AG.
Yes. So I have been training on the Transportation Committee since I got into office. I was training on the Housing Committee since I got into office, and I'm on both. So I'm very happy to be on both of those committees. And again, I think those issues are very tied together. So in terms of transportation, as I mentioned, I had done a bill that got signed into law that allows BART to buy directly from the grid, which saves both a lot of money and helps BART achieve their renewable energy goals. So that got signed into law last year. The bill I'm doing now, which I was a joint author on, Mr. Bonta's bill, as you mentioned, would allow for the creation of a bus-only HOV lane on the Bay Bridge. And it's kind of shocking to me that doesn't exist right now. And I think, we need to do things like, we need to build another Transbay tube. We know that, right? And again, I think things have changed a little bit because of COVID, where there's not as many people traveling into the city and whatnot. And maybe with telework that will change, but still fundamentally, we need to invest in our infrastructure in terms of our rail system. And so things like building a Transbay tunnel, I think, are part of the equation. That is a huge financial commitment. But what we can do in the meantime is do things like AB 455, which I'm now the lead author on, as Mr. Bonta, as you mentioned, went to the AG's office. And that will allow for an HOV bus-only lane. And I think the more that we can actually promote things like buses, the faster we can address our transportation issues. The other critical issue is really the streamlining of all these different agencies that work in transportation in the Bay Area. I think there's 27 different local municipalities. So I had joined with David Chu on a bill to help streamline that communication and process and ensuring that those agencies are kind of all talking to each other. So those are some of the things that I think are important in terms of public transportation. Again, I'll try to slow down because I know I talk so quickly, I apologize. In terms of supporting clean vehicles, charging stations, things of this nature are important, but also making sure that if we are doing things like rebates for, EVs and things like this, that we're also being very mindful of our low-income communities that will be able to access those types of things.
Here's a question from a senior at Berkeley High School. What's your advice to a young woman hoping to pursue a career in politics?
So I was once you and interested in politics. And I actually started taking political science classes at my local community college when I was in high school, because I was so interested in it. But I started volunteering on campaigns. I started volunteering with organizations. I did that all through college, and just, sort of picking an issue that you care about and getting involved and letting your voice be heard. Offices like mine have internships, Nancy Skinner's do, I'm sure Barbara Lee's do as well. But getting involved locally is really key. There's also, I think, getting involved locally with your local city council members or your local mayor's offices are also really, really important. You get exposed to a lot of different things when you do that, and just jumping in and kind of getting your feet wet, I think, is the most important thing. If there's an issue you care about, there's an organization out there who advocates on this. And I will say I'm inspired every day by the young people that I meet that care, and I think young folks get a bad rap. I think people think, oh, young people, they don't vote, they don't care, all this sort of stuff. Young people care. The young people I meet, they care, and they are the future of this country. And they inspire me every single day. So I'm excited that you're on this forum. You should also ask to meet with your local reps. I meet with constituents all the time. And to me, meeting with local people, do I get requests from lobbyists all day, every day, special interest groups all day, every day. But the most important meetings that I take are the ones with my constituents. So I would, know who your local council person is, know who your local folks are, your school board members, obviously your mayor, know who your state rep and senators are, and ask to meet with them and to talk about the issues that you care about. That's a good, easy way to entree into these things. So I'm excited that you're on here and hope that you do those things. And I'm happy to sit down and meet with you myself.
This constituent's asking, first of all, saying California currently allows fracking. This process pollutes underground water. Can fracking be permanently stopped in our state?
Well, I was the co-author on the bill that would have done this, that Scott Wiener was leading on, that just died in committee a couple of weeks ago. I think it's going to have to be eventually, right? The question is when, I think. I do think it can be permanently stopped. It's just a question of when, and this goes to the larger question around renewables, and this sort of transfer from old fossil fuels into renewable energy. It has to happen, and it has to happen very soon, because we're seeing the impacts of it in terms of our wildfires. And I think of this as the mom of a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old. And I remember last year when we had the day that like the sun never rose, when the sky was really orange. You guys remember that day? And I was walking my daughter to school, and she said, "Mommy, what happened to the sun?" And it was like very heartbreaking, for me to explain, like, we've messed it up. And I think about, like emotional, think about, but like the world that we're leaving her, right? So sorry, but I don't mean to be hyperbolic about it, but I think about the world we're leaving our kids, and so it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, because I think we have to move. And, a piece of that equation is this concept of, just transition, and ensuring that, the jobs that are held by our refinery workers are good union paying jobs, and how do we ensure that the transition that they are going to undergo ensures that they continue to have good paying, high paying jobs. And that is a point of contention in this debate, right? And so I think we need thoughtful folks at the table to figure out the answers to those questions, and I'm committed to working on it.
Question from a resident: will you support amending the erroneous designation of North Berkeley BART as an urban city center and change it back to residential? This designation was made by an algorithm that totally ignores the true nature of the neighborhood and is completely inappropriate.
I'd have to look into that question. I don't know how the designation was made, nor do I have authority over it, but I'm happy to learn more about it and see, and talk to folks talk to Latifa on the BART board and get more information on it. But I don't think I could take it a sort of a opinion one way or the other on it right now.
Would you be willing to introduce legislation to protect consumers and workers from chemical exposures? This resident says that chemicals don't need to be tested for safety. This is her understanding, that chemicals don't need to be tested for safety before market introduction, but that chemicals need to be proven to be a dangerous thing before they must be pulled from the market. Do you have any expertise on this or perspective on it?
That's a really good question. I did a bill last year with one of my colleagues, Al Martsucci from Torrance, California, and it was all around chemicals within our beauty products. And the fact that we don't actually have pretty strict, and we have pretty outdated standards in terms of this, and to bring it on par with what Europe's regulations are in terms of, and this is products that you're putting on your face and your skin. My 9-month-old comes and like eats my face, every day when I see her, and I'm like, what do I have on my face in terms of products, So I say that by way of saying I've worked a little bit in this space in terms of beauty products and personal hygiene products. And I do think, the chemicals that we are using in our society right now, I don't even know that we totally understand the dangerous impact of what we're doing. And we do need stricter regulations. So if you have specific ideas on that, I'd be happy to work with you on it, to whoever asked the question.
And they can contact your office, I assume.
Yep.
Okay. There are so many things to work on and to pay attention. For those of us who want to advocate for good legislation, Where should we put our energy? Where will we help the most? Single payer healthcare, violence, housing, homelessness, or something else?
This is like the $64,000 question. And I will say, like, when I got this job, after like the longest job interview of all time on that campaign in 2018, and then got reelected, I didn't know if I would like the job, honestly, because I'd never been a legislator. I've never been an elected official before. And it turns out I love the job. And I think it's very entrepreneurial and very intellectually stimulating. And I'm very like curious about all of these different issues. And it was just very exciting. And it continues to be of like, oh, we can fix so many things, right? And we have so many problems. And I'll hear a story on NPR and then I'll say, oh, I want to do a bill on this. This is a problem. Let's try to fix it. But the converse of that is that you can go crazy kind of trying to fix everything, right? And you have to, as a legislator and as an advocate too, kind of winnow down what do you see as the most important things that we can work on. And so part of this, I think, is like what drives you as a person, but also where are our greatest opportunities right now? And, I think when I look at our greatest opportunities and matching that with our needs, we have the Biden administration that's going to put a lot of resources into the state of California. How do we spend that money, right? Do we spend it on a new grid, on high-speed rail, on more funding for BART and our other transportation needs? Do we spend it on tackling our homelessness problem? Do we spend it on, climate change resiliency infrastructure, our education, right? So there are a lot of things that we need to confront, and I sort of take the view that I think like some of the most pressing things are, which has been mentioned tonight, climate change and what we're doing to address that. So how are those resources going to be spent towards that end? Homelessness, huge issue, right? And housing. And I kind of put those two things together. And then the third bucket for me is, our children. And that means paid leave policies, early childhood care and education and access, and our K through 12 school system. So those are the three, in my opinion, that I think are some of the most pressing in terms of the biggest opportunities that we see right in front of us right now. And how do we take this crisis and turn it into an opportunity for change on these really compelling issues where we have good federal partners and we have strong state leadership. So I don't know if I'm answering the question other than to say, I think it's trying to narrow these things down a little bit and figure out also just what kind of personally motivates you as a person. And then, calling your legislators' feet to the fire, calling your members and joining an organization to advocate on this stuff. But there's a lot to kind of care about. But I also think there's a big opportunity for us to make some real serious change in some of these places here.
In your opening presentation, you brought us highlights of the bills that you're sponsoring and including these two. And this resident is asking a little bit beyond that. You're co-sponsoring the Anti-Discrimination for Caregivers Act and the Chosen Family Act. If they're passed, can you tell us a little bit about before they're passed, what's been the reception by stakeholder constituencies? And do you have a sense whether these bills will have enough support to pass?
It's a great question. And these are two of my top priorities in terms of the bills that I'm leading on. With both of these bills, we have pretty widespread support from women's organizations, from the LGBTQ community, from organizations like Equal Rights Advocates. There's, I think, some widespread support amongst the progressive community. Where we've met some resistance is the business community. Both of the bills were listed as job killers by the Chamber of Commerce. And I was able to get the Chosen Family Bill off the job killer list by making some amendments. And I'm very willing to work with business to see if we can come to some kind of an agreement where I can continue to push for the core parts of the bill. If there's a way to make it a little bit easier for business, I'm very mindful of where our small businesses are in particular right now because of COVID. So I'm very mindful of that. But at the same time, I also recognize that, we have to do better by our families. Both of these bills are now headed to the Appropriations Committee, where they may make amendments to them, but assuming I can get them out of there, then they go to the floor. So they've already crossed the bigger hurdles in terms of the committees in so far in the assembly. Getting them off the floor, especially the discrimination bill, that is still on the job killer list by the chamber. So I'll have to work for those votes, and the one thing I've learned in my couple of years I've been in the legislature, that means a lot of conversations with my colleagues, explaining to them why I'm doing the bill, what the impact of the bill will be. We've looked at where similar bills have passed in other states, and have we seen things like frivolous lawsuits, which is an argument that the chamber is saying, or businesses going out of business because of it, right? And so we look for evidence to say, and we found it that says you won't see frivolous lawsuits. Businesses won't go out of business because of these bills, right? So it's just a lot of conversations, and it's part of politics, right? It's I am very intentional about building relationships with my colleagues, and that's based on trust and honesty, and which is the one thing I've learned in this business is you have one thing, it's your word. And so it's important never to go back on your word with your colleagues. I hope that they view me as a honest, trustworthy person. And so when I have a conversation with them and try to provide a different perspective than what some of the opposition is saying, that I hope that they take that into consideration. And some of my colleagues have other interests, right? So they may vote against the bills or not vote for them, but I got to get to 41 out of 80 on the floor. And I sort of view when I work a bill, I come out of organizing and I sort of think I'm like the precinct captain of that bill, and I've got to get to that 50% plus one, which is 41 votes. I'm one, so I need 40 more of my colleagues. And so it's really trying to speak to their interests and move the bill. So I'm hopeful we can do that. And then it has to go to the Senate and go through the committee process there and go through the Senate floor there. But I think these bills are important because they provide equity. We've got strong supporters of them. I've got a really smart staff working on them. And I am relentless when it comes to working my bills. I will call any colleague, I will text, I will show up in their office, I will talk to them on the floor, I will set up times through their scheduler, I will get to them and have the conversation. And if, I've had bills that don't make it through, but it's not for lack of trying, so I'm committed to these bills, as am my whole package, but these are my top two priority.
One of your constituents wants to know what's being done in the legislature, particularly in the assembly, to fix the Employment Development Department disaster and to hold those people responsible and accountable. Huge amounts of money were distributed to people who shouldn't have received the money. And can that money be recovered?
That is a great question. And, there's a handful of us, myself included, along with Lorena Gonzalez, David Chu from San Francisco, Kati Petrie-Norris, who heads up our Government Accountability Committee. She's leading on an EDD fraud bill that would help to hopefully safeguard against what has happened in terms of the fraudulent activity that took place. I'm leading on the bill to create an office of like an advocate office so that folks that never received their funds could have somewhere to go. We have I think it's like 5 or 6 bills in this space to deal with exactly what you just asked about. We have been in ongoing negotiations with the governor's office about these bills, but it has become very clear that this wasn't run well. It's just true. And, and I'm a big believer in government's ability to help people. But it also means when we're not doing the job that we need to hold ourselves accountable. And part of the job of the assembly is ensuring that there's oversight on these things. And so I'm committed to it. I'm running bills on this, as are my colleagues, and we're in regular negotiations with the governor's office on it. They've been very receptive to it. They recognize the problem, and I'm also sympathetic to the fact that no one anticipated this pandemic. Our EDD office was not set up to deal with the craziness that kind of came their way. So I get that, but it doesn't mean we have to let it go. We have to fix it. And so there's a number of us working on bills towards that end. So I appreciate that question.
What do you think of putting solar panels on the peripheral canal? How difficult, how expensive, how effective would that be?
I don't know the answer to how expensive or difficult, but it seems like a good idea to me and worth exploring.
We're doing really good on time, and we have time for a few more questions, just a
Great.
couple more. The city of Napa and perhaps other cities that were impacted by the wildfires have been exploring ways of persuading local businesses depending on low-income labor normally residing outside their communities to contribute to the cost of housing for their own workers, for instance, in the city of Napa. Would it be feasible for the state, through the Department of Housing and Community Development, to provide some sort of support statewide for this type of effort? Would legislative action be necessary to enact such a program?
That's interesting. I don't think legislative action would be necessary to enact some kind of a program like that. It could potentially be done through HCD on its own, but I don't know exactly. I'd have to look into it. But I do think the dearth of housing is also part of the problem, when we need to, again, go back to, more housing production as part of the solution.
And this resident asks if you can spend a couple moments here and go more in depth on the funding structures of K-12 education.
Yeah, I mean, our K through 12 system, I mean, frankly, has been underfunded since 1978, when we passed Prop 13, and started slowly defunding our public schools because of that measure. Obviously, there was an effort to close the commercial loophole this past fall that didn't pass. But we've just continually underfunded our public education system, and we see it. I think with COVID now, we've seen, unfortunately, districts are losing students increasingly. And so the question, I think, is, will those students come back in the fall? What will school look like in the fall, I think, is still an open-ended question. I think we are getting towards 5 days full time. That's what I know I'm committed to. But in terms of the funding, mechanism, there's been a big infusion of a one-time spending that the governor has put into the budget that was tied to reopening metrics that many of the districts met. So I think, my assumption is there will be similar, monies coming down towards that end for the fall as well. But I do think, the fundamental structural issue is Prop 13, and we have to continue to figure out how to address that. The other, I think, piece of this, or something that we should also look into, is the idea of another a wealth tax on our highest earners. Our highest earners did well through the pandemic, right? That's the $56 billion, additional funds that we didn't anticipate. So I think we should reconsider that. Another idea is reducing the threshold for local properties or local municipalities to have measures on the ballot to increase taxes for their local school districts, because right now it's a 2/3 vote, I think, required to do increase taxes for local municipalities. But I think we should reduce that threshold to 50% plus one.
Thank you. This is going to be the last question from the town forum for tonight. Can you describe what new low-income and affordable housing developments should look like? Should they be mixed income neighborhoods with varied sizes of buildings and parks and playgrounds and grocery stores, or something else?
So I'm actually chairing a select committee on social housing. And social housing is a concept that's a newer concept in the idea of that we were borrowing from, places in Europe, Singapore, and other places. There's some newer conversations in Hawaii and Maryland and other places around this concept, where basically it's, state-funded housing, but it's multi-family housing of mixed income, so that we are ensuring that our low-income folks are living in the same building as our higher income folks, to ensure more diversity, to ensure that we are not creating a situation of kind of the public housing of yesteryear where you place particularly communities of color into public housing and then have a real shortage of quality education and grocery store deserts and things of this nature. But mixing families of different income into the same building, and also creating opportunities for home ownership, all around the idea of creating the types of communities that I know many of us want to see, right? Where you have people of all different, socioeconomic backgrounds and racial and ethnic backgrounds living in the same place, enjoying the same public goods, public transportation, public parks, grocery stores, schools, et cetera. So that's the vision that I want to see, where we can really create that. And I think there's a way to do it. And I've got a 2-year select committee that I'm chairing to explore this concept. Ideally built by union labor, so that we're ensuring that these are also good jobs coming out of this, and working towards an idea of real equity when it comes to housing.
Let's try and fit in one more question. Sure. Is that all right?
Sure.
One more quick question. How can this resident's neighborhood fire safety group work with the state to mitigate the danger from wildfires in, for instance, the Berkeley Hills during the coming red flag warning days?
Yes, that is a great question. So the Berkeley Hills, Susan Wengraf, I don't know whose district this person's in, but she's done a lot of great work in this space and is like on my speed dial and constantly telling me what we need to do at the state level. So just know if she's your council member that she's on it. But I think it's both working with your local city council members, with Mayor Arreguín and myself. We're looking at bills around better coordination between all the agencies to ensure, fire knows no geographic boundary. Fire does not care if it's in my assembly district or Rebecca Bauer-Cahan's assembly district, right? So that coordination is key. But I'm happy to meet with you and talk to you about what that can look like. But I am in regular conversations with our local electeds to this end.
Thank you so much. So now, can you help us wrap up the town hall with some closing statements for a couple minutes, and then we'll say our goodbyes. And we appreciate the audience questions. They were terrific, and they were a wide variety.
My closing statements really simply are: thank you for attending. Thank you for caring. Thank you for advocating on these issues and for the thoughtful questions, not only here tonight, but I know that everyone on this Zoom in their day-to-day life is someone who cares about our community, cares about our state, and cares about our country. And, we have just, as a nation, gone through a lot. I know this is a nonpartisan forum, but in my opinion, just had the worst president we've ever had. We are recovering from that. We are a nation who is grappling with the real recognition of the systemic racism that this country was created on and still exists today. That has taken shape in many ways. We are grappling with, the effects of hi, sweetie. And here's my 4-year-old, COVID-19 and what that has meant for our communities. I will say, she's part of the reason why I do the work that I do, because I think about what her life is going to look like and how we are going to address these issues of the ones I just mentioned. And I know that you all are thought partners in that. You may not have agreed with everything I've said tonight, and that's okay. I can't be all things to all people, but I promise I will always be truthful and honest about where I'm at on issues. But I do solicit all input, all advice and thoughts and ideas. And I welcome you all to reach out to my office for more conversations.
Well, on behalf of all of the 4 leagues that helped produce this town hall, but most importantly, all the constituents, the people, the residents who wanted to connect with you, we thank you so much, Assemblymember Wicks, for your time and attention to the variety of issues we brought up tonight. This is the time we can have a town hall in this format, but we really look forward to the opportunity to be in a room together with you, with our neighbors, and to really convene and share the strengths we have in our community. We also want to thank the audience again for joining in this town hall, engaging the conversation via your questions. It's been really good flow of questions, and we appreciate everyone's attention. The members of the League of Women Voters are where the hands-on work is done to safeguard democracy. While we never endorse a candidate, we are directly involved in shaping important issues to keep our community strong. If you'd like to be involved with the men and women helping make democracy work, it's easy to join the League. Just check your local League website. And here's the 4 websites that you can look in and find out all kinds of information. And to wrap up, let me call your attention again to the screen. We're going to show you some upcoming events that are really a great variety of things hosted again by the League of Women Voters. Tomorrow, Alameda County District Attorney Nancy O'Malley will be discussing important work that she is doing with abused and homeless women, the many challenges that COVID-19 has posed, and the ways in which the current lack of civility in politics is impeding the pace and scale of progress for women who suffer from violence. Also, we invite you to join activists across the nation on Saturday, May 8th, for the John Lewis Votercades. These are being hosted in over 100 cities around the country. The Votercades will bring awareness to S1 and HR 4. These are 2 bills aimed to expand people's voting and civil rights. These events are also sponsored by the League of Women Voters Piedmont and Oakland. Our local Votercade is starting and ending with speakers and events at the Oakland Coliseum. The League of Women Voters of the United States and the League of Women Voters of California are endorsing the Unity Against Hate rally. That's May 15th, and we invite you to join the many voices in raising awareness of the verbal and physical violence perpetrated on Asian and Pacific Islander Americans. And finally, here on the screen, you'll see a promo here about the League of Women Voters virtual convention. This is happening in June 7th through the 13th. We have a great variety of events, workshops throughout the week. Topics include water policy, housing, criminal justice reform, and a whole lot more. The registration for workshops, including some that are open and free to the public, is available online. Again, just go to that website you see on your screen and think about attending and observing some of these great speakers and content coming from the League of Women Voters California Convention. And our special thanks again to our Assembly member and her 9-month-old. Hello there. We look forward to seeing you all at a future town hall. Thanks everyone, and good evening.
Thank you. Thanks.